Breakout is a game where you hit a ball into bricks with a paddle until Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak leave to sell the first Apple computer. Besides accelerating their careers, it was a major commercial success for Atari. And judging by the fact I've made this video, one of the most cloned games of all time. Clearly there were a couple of game developers who looked at this and thought, hey, if I make my own version of this, people will pay money for it. Also, nag screens. In all fairness, it might be better to call some of these games Arkanoid clones, since most of them add power-ups, enemies, different types of blocks, or other sorts of variety to the base concept. Arkanoid in itself was a successful expansion of the Breakout formula, and it probably launched 1,000 clones of its own. Some of them are pretty shameless. Some of the devs couldn't even come up with a name that didn't scream copyright infringement. Speaking of totally not copyright infringement, Elektronoid changes up the name just enough that Taito wouldn't sue. I think they were too busy developing Puzzle Bobble. Elektronoid was developed by a company called Pixel Painters, and they weren't around for very long. Most of their work was pretty basic, and even Elektronoid is referred to as a gamelet. It certainly puts its best foot forward with this completely excellent tune that isn't random and incoherent in any way. Can't fault the rest of the game significantly, though. Plays well enough with working controls and a reasonable array of power-ups. There are a few things that bug me about this, though. For instance, all the animations in the menu and introduction slow things down, but you can hold shift to skip through them, which looks rather silly. Some of the randomly spawning enemies seem poorly thought out, like the Menacers that can release all sorts of havoc-inducing balls in your game. The green one is the worst. Once its ball contaminates some of your blocks, you have to wait and hope a red Menacer will spawn. If that doesn't add arbitrary levels of pettiness to this game, then the next game I'm covering isn't Cybersphere Plus. Honestly, I don't really have much of a complaint about Elektronoid, besides the music, which is really quite stupid and banal. At least you can turn it off. Cybersphere Plus, on the other hand, is great music. Told you I'd be covering it. Like Elektronoid before it, it's OPL3 based FM synthesis, but Clay Hellman really got some mileage out of that chip. In fact, I put his mastery of OPL3 here on par with games like Tyrion and the original Warcraft. Cybersphere doesn't have as much music as those two games, but it's a shorter game that doesn't really need to have as much music. What I like about this one is that while it's probably the simplest game here, it's very polished. There's a nice, consistent, and somewhat minimalist aesthetic that makes it easy to read what's going on in the game. Default speeds and settings seem just right, and it has a lot of nice quality of life features that make it more playable. For instance, if you've picked up extra ball power-ups and then lose all but one of your balls, you get a little warning message in case you're not paying attention. And if you aren't, that's probably why you lost your balls in the first place. I actually play this one occasionally outside the context of gathering footage for this video, just because it's a good game. I recently found out that this game was originally written for the Commodore Amiga in 1994, and then it was ported to DOS a bit later. The versions are pretty similar and they actually share some of the same music, but the DOS version feels a bit faster and more responsive, though that also makes it more difficult. Examples are synthesis, pick your poison. Cybersphere Plus is worth your time. After two good games, how about a piece of crap? I played Aquinoid a few times as a kid, and even then I didn't particularly like it. The problem with childhood is that you tend to have a dangerously high tolerance for boredom. Aquinoid has a lot of problems, but the first you'll notice is that it simply looks and sounds ugly, even by the standards of 1992. I've never been very impressed with the internal speaker on the IBM PC. Also, with enough CPU power and programming ability, you can play complicated polyphonic music or even play sample audio. Aquinoid just has beeps and bloops. devs also made incredibly bad color choices. So even on the best of times, this game just looks sickening. Now, if the game wasn't way too hard for all the wrong reasons, I'd be able to forgive this. But really, this is a terrible game. It seems to have timing issues. Well, it does have a limiter, so it doesn't run incredibly fast on modern systems, or, well, whatever you're going to get in DOSBox. The maximum speed is too fast for its own good. Slowing it down to something more reasonable just reveals a lot of flaws in the level design. Mouse sensitivity is also an issue here, while the last two games we covered just isn't. I'm no hardcore Breakout pulling professional, but given how fast the ball moves, even the fastest paddle speed is too slow. It gets worse though. Most games in this genre allow you to influence your ball's trajectory by either hitting it at the edges of the paddle, or giving the ball some spin by moving the paddle as you hit the ball. As far as I can tell, Aquin White lacks this basic functionality, so unless you can figure out the janky tilt mechanic, you're basically at the mercy of where you initially launch your ball and what power-ups you get. And these power-ups are horrible! They have strange names that rarely tell you what the hell they do. Some of them have incredibly cruel effects, like reversing your controls, making the ball nearly invisible, moving a life from your stock, or knocking you back to the last level. Also, the levels quickly get way more tedious than they ought to be. Let's take a look at level 20. Now, unless you use the built-in password system, you get a free password every 10 levels, you're probably going to give up in frustration before you get here. But Maze of Patience requires you to clear a long corridor of blocks by making them shoot each other, and then walk your way through a long, nearly indestructible corridor without any power-ups. Well, not any reliable power-ups, and with extreme precision. If the controls weren't horribly borked, this wouldn't be as irritating. Poor level design is poor level design. Even the devs seem to think that one is a bit too much. It gets even worse, though. This game is incredibly smart. It's full of self-praising text. First, you'll notice that the main menu refers to the gameplay as brilliant action. Tell you what, let's just take a look at what the devs have to say for themselves. In 1991, a new star is born. Aquin White version 1.35! The Breakout clone that satisfies the highest demand and sets new standards in shareware action games. Programmed by Stefan Heinecke and Karsten Finger, these two talented programmers would like to send friendly greetings to Microsoft for their good old DOS, Intel for their fast CPUs, Coca-Cola and Jaeger pills for refreshing drinks, IBU for their tasty potato chips, and you know what? Let's get out of here before my video persona gets the better of me and convinces me to come out of your computer screen and kill you. Kryptonics is another Amiga native Breakout game that eventually got a DOS remake with much improved graphics. Then it got ported again to newer hardware, complete with menus that clash with the art style of the game, which anyways is just incredibly gaudy. It's got goofy sounds and incredibly bright graphics, at least if you're playing the remade versions. It doesn't have any music in-game, unless you're playing the latest remakes, in which case you get a song named Blitz by a fellow named Monty that was originally featured in Deluxe Galga, I think. I don't know, I'm not sure. There's menu and title screen music in all the versions, although none of it is anything special. This is another serviceable shareware Breakout title if you really need to get your fix. It's got the amenities you would expect from a title of its vintage. I note that it seems to have an affinity for giving you multiple balls on the field and then giving you ball-sized power-ups that turn your session into complete and utter chaos. If that doesn't count as testosterone level, then consider yourself lucky for not having a dirty machination. None of the power-ups or threats seem to have the same level of asshole factor as Aquin White. And there are enough levels to more than satiate you. Also, for some reason, it turns into a horizontal shooter towards the end. I'm not sure why, but to be honest, I am not particularly interested in this one. It's playable and perhaps even good, but it's not really to my taste within this genre. And as you might have noticed, I have not become a Breakout junkie yet. It's common practice to save the best for last. Enter Steve Morath, the Dark Lord of Shareware, and your new god. Morath cut his teeth on some very old-school RPGs, long dungeon crawls with relatively simple mechanics, to be fair. Eventually, he made his way into the casual puzzle and board game scene. Now, it seems that Morath rather enjoyed being on the cutting edge of graphics programming. In the late 80s, your typical Morathware game could run at incredibly high resolutions. Think 1024 x 768 x 256 colors when your average DOS programmer had no idea how to do EGA well. He was looking at you, high-tech expressions. If you were fortunate enough to have some sort of add-in graphics card back in the day, you could probably wow with your friends with how ridiculously small and precise your pixels were. So more likely, you were on a corporate computer doing CAD or 3D rendering, and you were technically not allowed to install video games. Also, Morath's art direction kind of lagged behind. Unlike every other game I've covered in this video, Morath's Ultra Blast is Windows native. There's a few versions of this floating around, but the one I've picked up is for Windows 3.1. It also came out in the midst of the multimedia revolution, so guess what? Instead of incredibly high resolutions, you get stock photography all over the place. Ultra Blast is a very trippy game. Each block looks like old clip art, each ball's got a little animation, most of the sound effects seem inappropriate to the point of being creepy, and to top it off, the game runs at a pretty low frame rate, making movements jerky, flicker a lot, and sometimes they're harder to parse than necessary. There's also a lot of strange text throughout the game, such as the spaghetti dinner thing on the loading screen, and a political track that's longer than the actual in-game documentation. I'm not going to comment on its contents, but the fact that it's in there reflects some interesting priorities on Morath's part. The game gives you several options of gameplay style. The traditional and falling walls options are reminiscent of the original Breakout, but I'm going to focus on special effects since it's pretty special. There's no power-ups, but the emphasis is on hitting blocks with strange behaviors. Some of them just move around, some of them act as walls, one-way walls even. Some of them change the size of your paddle, some of them give you more balls, some devour your balls, and so forth. A few multipliers will turn your session into a frothing, chaotic mess that puts every other game I've talked about to shame. The game's sound routine can only play a single sound effect at a time. More than one sound effect at a time is going to result in, well, a low buzzing noise that you can probably hear if you're paying attention to the video. However, you can also load up a MIDI and listen to it while you play, which isn't bad if you want to get your Canyon.mid fix on. To load each MIDI manually though, and that could be a bit too annoying for the average person, I don't know. Perhaps the greatest flaw in the gameplay is it can move the paddle to almost any point on the screen, although you can't travel through walls. I mean, in Kryptonics you could also do this, but there you had to pick up a power-up to do so, and it wasn't nearly as problematic. But anyways, while this really does interfere with the behavior of the balls, or, well, squares, since they are squares, it's not necessarily very helpful. You might lose the balls anyways because the frame rate is so low. Also...
Hi, I'm Steve Morath. Please purchase these games.
Honestly, I'm not sure I can take Ultra Blast seriously as a game. It's fun to load up occasionally and screw around with just because it's so janky, but I can't see myself paying any sum of money for it outside, I don't know, maybe some sort of bundle? I don't know if the later versions are as problematic, but the screenshots I've seen suggest they share the same sense of aesthetics. They're a bit more polished anyways, but Ultra Blast is never going to be that pleasant to look at, I don't think. though people almost certainly would have went nuts for them when they were originally released. Remember, folks, the multimedia explosion brought us Myst and that one symphonic death metal album by Waltari, but it also brought us what's distinguished stuff like this.
Package prices are under $5 per game.
Anyways, 3 out of 5, well, 3.5 out of 5 games possibly worth your time isn't bad given that we're in the realm of ancient DOS shareware. Cybersphere Plus is still the clear winner if you ask me. Some of these titles can still be purchased, Kryptonics obviously, and the entire world of Warcraft is in online stores. Whether or not they're worth the cost is debatable, but whatever. Cybersphere Plus, however, is now freeware, so you might as well check that one out. Seems like I'm pressuring you to play it, because I am. You'll note that there have been more than 5 Breakout clones in the history of humanity, even on DOS. My main reasons for discussing these is that I've had the luxury of actually playing them, generally in their shareware versions. You can't believe how much actually experiencing this stuff for yourself causes you to form opinions on it. Alternatively, you could just watch videos on YouTube.